Thanks for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have Rayne here and been here for the workshop this last week and to hear about drone training. I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting this seminar on the traditional territory of the Gidim clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I'd like to also thank Wet'suwet'en Community Forest for their funding that enabled this workshop to happen and to bring Rayne here. Rayne has an incredible CV. Their list of experiences is incredibly diverse and incredibly fascinating. Um, they have a Bachelor of Science in Environment and Society from Florida State University, and Rayne also finished their master's just recently in May, so congratulations. um, their research focuses on the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge, unmanned aircraft systems, and Indigenous capacity building in natural resource governance. Their professional experience includes over 4 years of field deployments and the participation and leading of professional training. They've instructed in over a dozen training courses for public safety officials in Florida. These trainings include skills utilizing geovisualization technology to conduct search and rescue operations, perform damage assessment on critical infrastructure, capture and process data to construct maps from drone imagery, and conduct drone operations indoors to simulate reconnaissance missions in debris fields. There is a very long list of fixed wing and other unmanned aircrafts that Rayne don't knows how to fly, and a whole variety of software. So if that is your interest, then please get in touch with Rayne. And Rayne is deployed as part of the CDRP UAS team to 6 state responses, including Hurricane Ian in 2022, Hurricane Idalia Urban Search and Rescue Response in 2023, Hurricane Debbie, and Hurricane Helene in 2024. So scheduling the workshop was very interesting. It had to be after cultural burn, before hurricane season. After hurricane season, there was a very narrow window. So glad we made it happen. Thanks so much, Rayne, and welcome.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Dawn, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Again, my name is Rayne Hawkins. I'm from Tallahassee, Florida, and this is a presentation that is expanding on a drone training conducted in 2023, my master's thesis research, and the workshop that was just conducted here last week with the Office of the Wet'suwet'en and the Get Meow Guardians program. And this presentation is about technological capacity building to support the traditional ecological knowledge of First Nations and to counter extractive industry activity on their territory. Before I really launch in, I'd like to again acknowledge that this research was conducted on the unceded Wet'suwet'en territory and the occupied and forcibly ceded lands of the Muskogee, Creek, Appalachie, Miccosukee, and Seminole tribes in Florida. And again, I want to express my gratitude to the Office of the Wet'suwet'en, who have welcomed me twice now onto the Utah to work with them, and for the Get Meow Laxiep Guardians for participating in the workshop this week. So a little bit of my background, I think Dawn covered it pretty well, but my day job is working in emergency management at Florida State University. And what we do there is, as part of our academic program, teach students about emergency management and how that overlaps with disaster intelligence and collecting disaster intelligence through drones and also human intelligence. And I've been doing that for the last 5 years. The gray sky part of that job is we are a state deployable resource for the state of Florida to respond to disasters, which include hurricanes, structural collapses, tornadoes, missing persons, etc. And we do a lot of training with public safety agencies in Florida. Most of the law enforcement agencies in Florida have at some point gone through our training program that we've written for them to use drones in their own work. And we also have a class that teaches students at Florida State how to fly drones and the principles of emergency management tied in with that. A big part of what I do on these deployments is disaster mapping, which is for reconnaissance, taking large wide area maps of areas to support ground teams who are doing searches or damage assessment for getting people back to their homes after a disaster. My specific role is in UAS logistics and GIS. UAS or unmanned aircraft systems are drones. And what my job is maintaining those, maintaining our inventory, doing updates, keeping track of software, keeping track of batteries, make sure that all of that equipment is where it's supposed to be. And then in the field, I do a lot of the processing of our drone data collection. I also want to acknowledge that all of my training has come from the Western colonial higher education system and the state of Florida public safety system. So I did come into this training and this kind of approach with that inherent bias that was built into how I was trained and how I was taught, which I'll talk about more later about how that learning curve has definitely influenced how I was able to conduct this training. So like I said, this stemmed from my thesis research, or it started as I approached Tyler, who was my advisor in my thesis, and said, I want to do something that's not just theoretical. I want to do actual work in the field. I don't want to just sit in a room and write hypothetical about something. And he was the one who put me in touch with the Office of the Wet'suwet'en to start the training in 2023. But these are the three main questions that framed that research. The first one is about natural resource governance and how that structure of provincial governance and First Nations governance is in conflict with each other. And I wanted to understand the gap in technological capacity between First Nations and the provincial government. The second part of this was the actual implementation of the drone training program, which was to assist natural resource governance and to support traditional ecological knowledge as it is applied to that governance. And the final part of this research was to address the technological questions that were articulated by the Office of the Wet'suwet'en. So using GIS or geographic information systems to analyze watershed mapping data to explore how the regulations of logging activity are enforced or are failed to be enforced. I'm going to start with a little bit more about the Division of Natural Resource Governance in British Columbia. So the first thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Office of the Wet'suwet'en governance is structured. I'm sure everybody has a little bit of a basic knowledge about this, but the Wet'suwet'en Nation is divided into 5 clans, 13 houses, and 38 house territories. And these clans are identified as a method of distinguishing families or houses who are stewards of their territory. The Western colonization of First Nations territories has led to the appropriation and assigned commodified value of territory, whereas the hereditary governance holds value in the reciprocal relationship between the community and the land. A concept that was told to me a lot was yinta, which is literally translates to mean land, but can be understood as territory in the sense of authority or stewardship and not ownership. It also helps to establish the connection and obligation of care for the community. The business of traditional governance is enacted through community feasts or balhats, which is a I cannot think of the word, but it's where decisions are announced with gifts of food and other materials from the land, and they represent the value of sharing and reciprocity in Wet'suwet'en governance. Fish are usually a central part of the feast ceremony, so salmon and salmon spawning grounds are critical in natural resource governance because of their central position in these ceremonies. Balhats are described as the governance structure that brings everybody together. It's utilized as a formal gathering to address Wet'suwet'en law, such as projects that would require intergovernmental decisions. Other First Nations governance systems have described these principles of governance as a basket that's neither depleting or diminishing in value to be passed on to future generations. The Office of the Wet'suwet'en was incorporated in 1994 as an entity to perform legal communications with the province. The previous natural resources manager described this to me as the incorporation to help fulfill realizing the authority and jurisdiction that stems from Wet'suwet'en title. So even without this organization, the hereditary governance system of the Wet'suwet'en would continue to exist. But it's because of the need to collaborate with the provincial government that First Nations have to translate their culture into the provincial language of governance. So I mentioned it briefly, but there's this concept that I expanded a little bit in my writing about the basket and the silo, comparing how natural resource governance is enacted in the Office of Wet'suwet'en and within the province. And there's a lot of elements that led to the province's failures on integrated and cumulative planning with First Nations. The first is Hudson's Bay Company, which was established as a fur trading company, eventually extending into other commodification industries like lumber, fishing, mining, and agriculture. It's also because of the geography of British Columbia that it's had an important influence on its governance. The geographic diversity and inconsistent elevation dissuaded investments in the north in the early years of the province. So resource extraction and export for processing has remained a staple of the economy in the Pacific Northwest, while Vancouver remains the central governance that's well removed from the north. So natural resource governance in British Columbia is enacted through a series of ministries that control various aspects of the natural environment. But they enact this legislation distinctly from each other, which is emblematic of that siloing of governance that remains distinct and doesn't necessarily interact with different branches, which is in direct contrast to the holistic view of governance that First Nations employs. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act of 2019 establishes treaties and negotiations to address consent-based decision-making or joint decision-making. But these agreements disregard First Nations traditional knowledge. In order for First Nations to work in a consensus with the ministries, they must first concede to using the language, technology, and knowledge that's prioritized by the province. And this training was undertaken to develop methods of contesting settler geographies through technology that is accessible and sustainable for technicians to use. And this was undertaken also, hopefully, to bolster the validity of knowledge holders and cultural knowledge held by the Wet'suwet'en community. In a monumental legal decision, colonial government was confronted with the basket as a legitimate means of natural resource government or natural resource management, which was the Bulkley-Valley case in 1997. This decision dictates that Indigenous peoples should be consulted and unsettled land rights and title reconciled. And this decision supports that traditional Indigenous knowledge is a valid form of evidence that establishes their presence and relationship with the land. The evidence of Wet'suwet'en land title exists in many different forms, such as oral histories and stories that don't reflect how the province values knowledge, which is most of the time through technology and quantitative data. So there is still no formal resolution for Indigenous title, despite the court case, and provincial authorities continue to permit extractive industry projects on unceded Wet'suwet'en territory that disrupts their enduring connection to the Yinta. So verifying evidence that's based in oral and scientific history through geovisualization was novel as an approach in the Delgamuukw-Gisdaywa case, but to build technology and technological capacity can be understood as a supplement to traditional ecological knowledge. It can be used to increase the capacity for Indigenous nations to practice hereditary governance in the face of the prevalent colonial structures that are forced on them by that siloing provincial structure. So I'm moving now to talk a little bit about how the drone training in 2023 was implemented and how it has expanded for the 2025 workshop that was just conducted. A lot of this is talking about quantitative methods like UAS and GIS technologies. UAS or drones, again, are remotely piloted sensors that can capture many different types of data. And GIS or geographic information systems are used to create an orthomosaic image of any kind of data that specifically the Office of Wet'suwet'en wanted to focus on. The point of collecting this data in 2023 was to contest the logging activity that impacts the health of the watershed. Provincial regulations on riparian zones are, while written out, are generally not enforced and very poorly written and understood. So using tools like remote sensing, machine learning, and a specific platform called Google Earth Engine, we were able to classify drone mapping data and determine where provincial regulations were violated. So the key elements for effective training with First Nations have been, I've kind of split into three different main elements. The first one is grounding efforts in community values. Um, Training should be employed to answer community directed questions with data that can support their needs and their research, which specifically with Office of the Wet'suwet'en was monitoring the impacts on and the health of the Yenta. The second is to ensure a balanced and respectful exchange of knowledge. Researchers who engage with Indigenous communities must balance the knowledge they are given by traditional knowledge holders with the knowledge they offer in return. It has to be an equal relationship. And finally, effective training should foster sustainable technological capacity. So in the 2023 training, the mapping data that was gathered via drones can be used to document and assess whether logging companies are maintaining the required riparian buffers around vital waterways. In the training design, I'm going to talk a little bit about a principle called verticality, which is moving beyond boundaries and terrain in two dimensions. It talks about how 3D visualization of space has come to include inherent power dynamics. And drones are used in this research as a new perspective and decentralized form of data collection. So by building skills in basic flight operations, mapping, and data management, skills that were chosen by the community to focus on based on what would best fit their needs for natural resource governance, trainers should provide options so that the ultimate decision-making power rests with the community. Options like, what kind of data do you want to collect? What would be the most useful thing? And then that way you can make decisions based on, you can make decisions for which specific airframes and which specific software would best suit the community. The specific options that were utilized in 2023 were the Phantom 4 Pro, which is a DJI aircraft that's capable of collecting 1 inch per pixel resolution, and Pix4D React, which is a software program that is used a lot in public safety because it is available without any internet or cellular connection. And the basic skills that are needed to utilize these platforms are widely applicable should the community expand or gain increased financial capacity to use different airframes. All of these skills are general enough to be applied to other airframes and other software platforms. So again, the training design was meant to contest settler geographies through technology that's accessible and sustainable. Specific skills covered were basic flight safety operations, mapping, processing imagery, and just practical use of drone systems. The technology should be widely applicable and transferable across platforms. And it's also important to evaluate the capability in the beginning of temporal and practical use of these systems so that it is sustainable over long-term use. Another facet of this study was to use ethnographic methods to determine how my positionality is influencing how I'm approaching this training. And the ethnographic study mostly takes form through stories, like vignettes that I capture and remember from being in the field with the technicians. I'm going to talk a couple stories and how they relate to these specific principles. The first one on centering Indigenous knowledge. I remember in the first training, Tisha, I'm going to talk about you a lot because you were there, but Tisha was telling me a couple times about how the research that we were doing or the research that you undertake, a lot of the times is lining up with what knowledge holders are telling you about the community, like specifically with riparian buffer zones. It's important for logging companies to leave a certain amount of space around waterways so that it maintains the health of the watershed. And when trees come out even close to that buffer, it means that the soil loosens and trees fall, and it eventually impacts the whole waterway in general. And a lot of that information, Tisha was saying, had been given to them by other people who don't have any hand in the research that's done on the territory necessarily, don't go out and collect the data, but know this information about the territory anyways. Sorry, it is warm in here. The second is environment-specific considerations, which is a very nice way of saying that I am terrified of bears. The first training that was undertaken, I was sitting with my advisor, Tyler, and he asked me what I was most worried about. And instead of anything that like had to do with actual research, I said bears. I'm so worried about running into a bear. Um, and that in 2023, the training went pretty well. The only bears that we saw were from safely inside the truck and from far away. But it reflected how how I actually operate for my job is so different than how I operate out here. The considerations are completely different, and the fears are different, but very real. Okay, because we saw bears. And I think on the second day that we were out there, Tisha and the other technician Vernon were like, "Come look at this! It's like a grizzly bear track, and it's like gigantic," which was, and I think that I was very concerned about it, and I think Tisha and Vernon were like, "Anyways," you just kept going on with your job, which is perfectly fine. Um, and this fear carried over to 2025. It wasn't a big deal, and I wasn't really thinking about it that much until the very last day of training when we arrived to our first training location to do mapping. And everyone's just opening the doors, and then we see in front of us just a grizzly, just like walk across the road very casually. Everyone is just like, okay, we're gonna leave now. Close the door back, we're going. Um, and that was maybe like the closest I've been. I wasn't super even out of the truck yet. I'm exaggerating because of the like anxiety around it. But at the second location, we had gotten out, we had done one mission, we had just taken off to start another one, and you see a cute little black bear cub run across the road, and then quickly realize that if the cub is there, the mom is there, and no one wants to meet her. So we pack it all up again and have to move again to go fly somewhere else. And again, this kind of like considerations would have never crossed my mind in Florida on a beach, but was a definite concern and something that impacted our operations on multiple days throughout the whole training. Um, the third principle here is reframing public safety operations and principles. There's a phrase that we use in my job that's Semper Gumby, which refers to that Gumby, like the chalk, clay, green cartoon figure, if anyone knows what I'm referring to, which is basically stay flexible. If you make plan A, you will end up enacting plan M every time. So staying flexible and making sure that you are adaptable to your environment and to any other factors about training is important in Florida for disaster operations, is because we don't have access to everything that we need to get to, and that happened again in this training. On Wednesday of last week, we had made this plan to drive really far back on the McDonald's South Service Road and fly from there to get imagery of a creek that hadn't been accessed or taken imagery of in some time. And we drove about an hour and a half before we got to this part of the road that was now just trees and not road anymore. And part of what we were going to do that day was taking video of this waterway, but also doing mapping, planning and practice with the Get Meow team who was out with us. But the thing about mapping missions is that you have to plan them where you have internet service. That's where you have the base map and the access to that. And so once we're actually out on this road and we can't get access to where we were supposed to fly from, now those mapping missions are null and void. We can't fly them anymore. So we've spent an hour and a half driving. We can't get to where we want to fly. And now we have to basically backtrack and try to figure out how to salvage this day with any new things that we can do. And this kind of leads into the last point, which is very personal about unlearning and relearning how to be a teacher in these environments. A lot of what my job is, especially in disaster environments, is about public safety and also life-saving missions. There's a lot of urgency implied with this kind of stuff that I do. And it's not necessarily applicable to missions that we're doing for vital waterways, but it's still like a gut reaction habit for me to be nervous if I feel like we're wasting time or if we're losing time. It's like a immediate anxiety about like having to call my boss and be like, we didn't finish the mission, I'm so sorry. So unlearning that anxiety and trying not to project that on the people that I'm working with is something that I struggled a lot with in 2023. It was a constant like fight with my brain of like, don't stress them out for no reason. The world is not gonna end. It's gonna be okay. And I think in this training this week, I'm not saying that I felt any less anxious, but I think I was able to kind of adapt a little bit more to the obstacles that we were facing and try to just be a little bit more understanding, both with myself and with the people around me, if we weren't able to achieve everything that I thought we had to get done. So yeah, that's a good summary of the ethnographic stuff and reflects a lot of the stories that I told in the actual paper. Let's Another big part of the research that I conducted and that I talked about in the paper was this principle or this theory called community-based participatory research. And that talks about, in the paper that I referenced, how higher education institutions and scholars and Indigenous communities interact with each other. In this paper, it was specifically talking about how higher education systems are interacting with Indigenous students, but in this case, I kind of reframed to talk about how trainers and Indigenous communities are interacting and discussing technological capacity building. So in this theory, there are 4 basic principles of how to employ this, which are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. The first one, respect, is kind of employed as a respect for the culture and the environment, even if I'm uncomfortable with the learning curve, like the bears and like the operational tempo, I have to respect the environment that I'm in and learn how to increase my comfortability and my domain of knowledge to include and respect the cultural values and traditions of the people I'm working with. The second principle, relevance, is that in training, what you're teaching and the knowledge that you're sharing needs to be relevant to current struggles. So specifically in terms of extractive industries and commodification, it's relevant for Indigenous communities and natural resource governance to have sovereignty over their own data and over their own evidence. They need to be able to own the information so that it's them who are providing the relevant information to the province to argue against their decisions. And reciprocity. Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when researchers are asking to be involved with Indigenous communities, it's important that it is a truly reciprocal relationship. The knowledge that's given should be comparable to the knowledge that's offered. The final principle is responsibility. It's my responsibility to care for the knowledge that's given to me and to be responsible for my place in the environment. It's my responsibility to evaluate how my biases are influencing the effectiveness of the research and the training as it's going on. And this is a very iterative process. It never stops me having to re-examine how I'm teaching and what I'm doing. So responsibility is a really big part of community-based participatory research. And as part of what I was writing for my thesis, my additional contribution to this theory relates to how Indigenous geographies are visualized, and that principle is remapping and reinterpretation. Countermapping specifically is a methodology for redesigning how Indigenous geographies are understood, removing them from the lens of Western colonial placemaking agendas, and removing the forces that commodify and extract natural resources and visualize the land for those purposes. Reinterpretation also helps to address the researchers, trainers, and other partners' role in how we challenge settler colonial understandings of space, resources, and knowledge. And also helps, again, to place the power and sovereignty of that knowledge into the hands of the stewards of their territory. All right, and moving into the final section of this, which was actually using that GIS technology to analyze forestry practices and compliance of riparian offsets. Countermapping, again, is how reinterpretation is practiced as a principle of community-based participatory research. Countermapping is important in representing Indigenous space because of the long history of dispossession and commodification of resources that happens on First Nations territory. It's a method that challenges settler colonial placemaking and helps to validate traditional knowledge of land rights and title through modern methods of visualization. Countermapping started as a grassroots effort to contest geographies by proving Indigenous occupation of space and creating spatial recognition of social disparities. So even despite the Wet'suwet'en countermapping projects and the fact that Aboriginal rights and title was formally recognized in the Canadian Constitution of 1982, the province of British Columbia continues to contest Wet'suwet'en land claims and allow extractive industry use to happen on Wet'suwet'en territory. So this research was an attempt to remap and reinterpret those settler geographies to establish that even colonizing entities don't abide by their own rules in the resource extraction industry. A little bit about the forestry practices in British Columbia. The most important note that I can make about this is that all of these regulations are self-enforced. The logging companies decide if they are enforcing them correctly. British Columbia doesn't really check on what they're doing. And B.C.'s compliance and enforcement database has recognized that logging companies have harvested without authorization at least 170 times since 2021. And that statistic is now 3-4 years old, so there's no telling how much it continues to happen. The Riparian Management Area Guidebook was established as part of the Forest and Range Practices Act to try to help minimize where logging activity is happening, that where riparian areas need to be protected. And those regulations took place in January of 2004, excuse me. So the specific area that we were operating in was, according to all of these rules by the British Columbia, was an S2 class river, which means that within 30 meters of a waterway, there needs to be absolutely no logging activity happening. And within an additional 20 meters, that activity is extremely limited. So, like I mentioned before, Google Earth Engine was the tool that we used a lot to analyze how this data could be used to counter extractive industry use. And it was chosen based on the accessibility of the data analysis. Google Earth Engine is a free platform that's driven by JavaScript coding language. And this, because it's free, because it's widely accessible, supports the capacity to support long-term projects without any financial strain on a community. And also because of the reliability of continuous access to data that the community owns. The goal of this was to classify the imagery into 3 distinct categories through machine learning, which were river, cut block, and dense forest area. And these classifications for this purpose would split along color pixel value ranges. So the ranges of green that count as dense forest that's never been logged, the ranges of blue that count as water, and the ranges of tan to white that count as sparse vegetation areas. So this was analyzed through 2 different methods to determine how riparian buffer zone regulations were being infringed upon. The first one uses that classification data achieved through machine learning to identify a statistic of class distribution, which basically means after that classification takes place and every pixel in the map is identified as one of those 3 classes, it then compares that with an overlap of where the riparian buffer zone is, and if any pixels classified as cut block are in that area, that would indicate that logging had happened where it was not legally supposed to. And the second method was just to use, I'll go back here. So these outer tan areas are all of the cut blocks identified by British Columbia. And the second method was to compare those polygons with how they overlap with the riparian buffers. So that's just how often the province has assigned cut blocks that encroach on that area. Not how much logging has actually happened, but how much from the beginning they said it's okay to log here, which is in direct violation of the regulations that they write. So in this picture here, you can see the polygons in red that aren't just rivers. So these here are polygons that overlap with the riparian buffer zones, and therefore logging activity that happened in violation of provincial regulations. And this is a graph or a table, excuse me, to show in both cases, in the 30-meter zone and a 50-meter zone, how many cut blocks and what size and what year of harvest those cut blocks happen. So even though in both of these cases, only one cut block was actually assigned and harvested after the riparian regulations rules has gone into effect after 2004, it doesn't mean that all of these cut blocks didn't impact the health of the watershed. It still means that it's impacting how trees are falling over the waterway and flooding areas that should be suitable for fish spawning habitats and now aren't, etc. So even if it's not in direct violation of provincial rule, it is still an impact on UTA. So a quick comparison between 2023 and the workshop that happened this year. The workshop that happened this year was less structured as a we need to collect this specific data and more of a refresher and teaching basic skills. The Get Meow team are experienced in field work and their own research, but not very experienced with drone use. So this was kind of a how do we set up this team to be as prepared as possible to continue their own program? What skills do they want to learn? What's the best method of continuing their education, etc. So here, the things that are the same between 2023 and 2025 and any communities that are involved with building technological capacity is that they need equitable support and recognition. It's still necessary to have meaningful engagement with partners, including setting up Indigenous communities to have meaningful engagement with the province when they take their data to argue against their decisions. It's also important to prioritize hereditary governance and traditional knowledge and any of the evidence and research that's being collected, and for communities to have sovereignty over data collection, management, and analysis. The things that are distinct about these operational contexts are how long the program has been in effect for. So the OW has been using drones at least since 2023, since the training, and before that with other resources. And Get Meow has been working minimally with drones. The equipment access, Get Meow had access to a DJI Mini, which is good for basic reconnaissance, but not capable of mapping. So having those considerations in place. And flight experience, again, how often people are flying and how often people have access to that equipment. And also what research endeavors they want to explore. Different communities are not going to have the exact same questions, which is why this time we didn't focus on a specific data collection for a specific project. It was more general, broadly, what skills do you want to know? How do we set you up to keep going? So the basic conclusions that came from the GIS analysis is that the province does not consistently enforce their own regulations regarding minimum riparian buffer zones. Future analysis can be done to detect the proximity of low down fallen trees to cut block areas to determine if there's a correlation between that, and other GIS analysis and programming techniques can be applied to repeat data sets to determine how fast log areas are growing back and to increase the accuracy of that land cover classification. So wrapping up now, just a general my reflection from each of those three research areas. The first is that technology should be understood as a supplement to support the inherent value and legitimacy of Indigenous knowledge, and that efforts should be undertaken to increase the capacity to practice hereditary governance. As far as the implementation of the training goes, understanding my biases and positionality as a trainer and a person is an iterative process of reflection and negotiation on how to best participate in research with other communities. And finally, with the analysis of the data, B.Sc and logging companies do not adhere to self-enforced regulations, and further analysis should be done to determine how research can be continued to provide evidence of commodification and misconduct on behalf of the province and logging companies. So I'm going to step aside now because Tisha, who was involved in the 2023 and 2025 training, is going to just talk very briefly about her reflection and experience during the training.
Hi everyone, I'm Tisha Pierre. I work at the Office of the Wet'suwet'en in the Natural Resources Department.
I am exhausted. I didn't think of second plan was just a big frog, and just thank you. I really enjoyed spending time with Rayne and participating in the training. I'm really grateful for it. I just have a little bit here written down. I apologize in advance if I said I was a little bit shy. So yeah, Rayne did a really great job with her presentations. Thank you, Rayne. In 2023, like you mentioned, she came up to Smithers and brought a wealth of GIS knowledge and expertise. Our department has been incredibly appreciative of her guidance and the skills she shared with us. Thanks to Rayne's program, we were gifted 2 Phantom 4 Pros, which we've been using in the field to collect data. It's an incredible asset to our team. We earned our drone pilot certifications before Rayne came up in the summer of 2023, and we received a lot of hands-on training in operating the aircraft and collecting various forms of data, including imagery and videos and mapping. So the skills have proven to be extremely valuable. Capturing aerial imagery has supported our reconnaissance efforts, enhanced community engagement and improved monitoring. So the ability to get up-to-date data, imagery, and mapping has been really beneficial because a lot of the formats online are quite outdated and don't really reflect the INTA in its state that it is. So being able to collect and process our own data in real time has been a real game changer. So we've used the drones for a number of different projects, including salmon habitat monitoring, trail mapping, cultural site documentation, and post-event assessments like flooding or erosion. So collecting data in certain parts of streams, and that has been really beneficial for some of the projects that we've been working on in our office, as well as with some collaborative projects. So the visuals and data we've collected help to inform decisions and communicate more effectively with the community and partner organizations. So yes, we're very grateful to you, Rayne. You've been very generous with your time and your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. I know that was painful, and I really appreciate you getting it. Yeah, and at that point, that's going to wrap up the presentation part, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time. Yeah.
I'm just super curious. I have a long-standing interest in fish in general, salmon in particular, and I think it's really interesting that we hear a lot about like salmon habitat. We hear a lot about salmon numbers and stuff like that. We don't often hear about how forestry impacts salmon. I mean, I know about riparian buffer zones. I know about like salmon spawning streams. I know about that, but I've never really connected how forestry is impacting salmon populations. I honestly haven't really made that connection before, and I think that there's something really interesting about the fact that not only is this analysis of fish often done in these kind of what seem to be compartmentalized ways. I don't know if there's any communication between DFO and forestry in the province, really, in relation to fish. And I guess I'm just super interested in the fact that we never hear about it spoken like that.
Right, which is why like holistic approach to natural resource governance is so important. There was conducted interviews for the thesis research, and one really important quote that someone told me was someone who worked for the province said like right hand and left hand don't know what each other are doing. There's not a lot of collaboration between forests or water resources or anything. They're not talking to each other, so there's no way to manage how forestry is impacting fish. There's no way for even if there was a way, there's not a whole lot of communication between those two groups.
Also because of provincial jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction.
Right.
So you have that inherent disconnect.
Question from online, Rayne. Just wondering if you could advise on why the Phantom 4 Pro was chosen over other DJI models like the Mavic or some of the thermal drones?
Right. So with the specific data that we're collecting, just mapping, the DJI Phantom 4 Pro is a solid aircraft to do that. The other reason that we use that is because there was an opportunity for the department that I work for to donate those aircraft to the community. That's honestly the most direct answer is like free is the best option sometimes. But it's a really solid aircraft. It continues to be a solid aircraft for reconnaissance. It's pretty well rated for wind. So in those like valley areas where there's a little bit of breeze happening all the time, it's a pretty solid aircraft and also has a decent battery time to conduct large mapping missions. But there are definitely other DJI platforms, more recent, that are good. The recent DJI Mavic 3 Enterprise is capable of mapping with native software, which is also a very good option.
I'm just curious about like going forward, like what are some of the other applications you could see potentially using this kind of technology for in this region?
I think the applications are very like so many, whatever you can think of. I think there's a way to apply new technology to it. I think one of the most recent things that was talked about with the Get Meow participants was cultural burn mapping, imaging areas before and after cultural burns to determine like well, it's up to them really what they want to do with that data, but just doing that kind of reconnaissance and information about territory as it changes, I think is a really applicable use.
And with burns though, can like thermal mapping be used to like increase the safety of burn operations?
Yes, so thermal mapping is it's like a burgeoning field. It's not super popular yet, but it is an option to use mapping with thermal sensors to determine hotspots in fires and to determine like rate of burn through an area, which is DJI newer aircraft and Autel newer aircraft are capable of collecting that imagery. Fire stations in Florida are using thermal a lot of the time for active burns or like active locations, like buildings that are on fire. It's a method of collecting information of like where do you aim the water. It's kind of like what's hot and what's not, which is a very simple use of thermal, but still very effective. Yeah, and the thermal sensors have swaths of like temperature ranges, and you can see which areas are hotter than other areas, and that's how they determine. It's like firefighting science. Yeah.